It's great to be back. You know, having been around since, quote, the Earth's crust began to cool, that's what I used to say when students say, Dean B, when did you come to the university? And my answer always was, well, I came back when the Earth's crust began to cool. And not long ago, I took a group of students out to lunch, and one of them said to me, Dean B, when did you come to the university? We already know the answer about the Earth's crust cooling. And I thought, uh-oh, the jig is up. I said, I can be as vain as the next person about such things. They said, don't worry, we won't tell. I said, right. So I said, I came as a freshman violinist to the Eastman School of Music in 1964. So I may as well have said 1664, right? So you can see the students doing the math. And one of them says to me, you're older than my father. I said, yep, and depending upon when your folks had you, I could be your grandfather. Then the student who asked me the question said, Dean B, that was over half a century ago. That's not something to hide, that's something to be proud of. And I thought, out of the mouths of babes, darn tootin', right? Yeah. So this September, it'll be 54 years since I came to the university, and most of those 54 years have been spent in connection with the university in some form, either as a student, as an officer of the institution, or as a faculty member. There are a few years when I was away doing other things, a total of 6 years when I was away doing other things. But most of my life has been lived here in the university. And what happens when you get to my ripe old age, I'll be 72 years old this August. I mean, and I don't look it, do I? That's the right answer. You begin to wonder about this place that first of all admitted you, right? I used to wait for the second letter from the admissions office telling me that a terrible mistake had been made. The Paul Burgett they really intended to admit could play the violin, asking me if I could pack my bags and leave under the cover of darkness, hopefully to spare us all the embarrassment. Well, I figure the statute of limitations has run out now, so I don't worry about that. But you wonder about this place that first of all admitted you, trained and educated you, and then turned you loose in its behalf. And so I've spent the last few years and continue to spend time in the library, in Rush Reese, in Rare Books and Special Collections, where Melissa Mead, who is the archivist, has been just extraordinarily helpful to me in looking at primary and secondary sources. And our story is a wonderful story. When I was here the first time, and we think it was back in November, I took us through the history up through the early days, got us up to President Reese. And what I'm hoping to do today is to move us forward and tell you stories using a lot of slides about the institution and focusing largely on what happened with the creation of the Memorial Art Gallery, the creation of the Eastman School of Music, the School of Medicine and Dentistry, what happened a little bit during the Valentine era and the Dekewood era. So let's just begin. Let's begin. I'm sort of trying to find a spot to make a smooth transition from what I did last year. So having started at the United States Hotel on West Main Street in 1850, in 1861 we moved to the Prince Street campus. And you can see all of that and hear about all of that in the presentation I did in November. The Prince Street campus, which is located the best way to say this for those of you who are not from Rochester, is in the area of the School of the Arts. And it's bounded by University Avenue, Prince Street, Goodman Street, and College Avenue. It's a 25-acre plot of land that had been owned by one of our trustees by the name of Azariah Booty. What a great 19th century Victorian name, right? And so those of you who are, and it's right across the street from the School of the Arts. And the School of the Arts originally was the residence hall for the Eastman School of Music. It's where I lived for 4 years. Prince Street, and I may have mentioned this when I was here before, Prince Street, one may wonder, well, Prince Street campus and there's Prince Street, where does that name come from? Well, does anybody remember, did I say that? Maybe I didn't, oh good. Oh, he says I did, yeah. Prince Street was the name of Azariah Booty's favorite horse. So now you know. So we moved to the Prince Street campus in 1861. And what you see here in this slide is the original entrance to the university. It's on Prince Street. Here you have the entrance. On this side is the School of the Arts, or the old Eastman dormitory. But one would make their way into, and this was a street that went all the way from Prince Street all the way to Goodman Street. This entranceway was made possible by a gift of 2 graduating classes, and I can't remember the dates, but they were like 1904 and 1892, something like that. So the next time you're on Prince Street, you can see these gates are still there. They're still there. Another slide that I put in that I thought you might find interesting, and if you look this behind this house here, this building is that dormitory that I talked about that is now the School of the Arts. And I put this here because this was the president's residence. This was called Seeley House, named for Harriet Seeley, who was the wife of President Rush Reese. So this house, eventually it was razed, obviously, because it's not there any longer, but this was the president's home. And the Board of Trustees would meet here or in Anderson Hall back in those historically ancient days. President Anderson was our president from 1853. For the first 3 years of our existence, we didn't have a president. From 1800 to 1853, because nobody would take the job. And so Asahel Kendrick, who I showed early on in my last appearance here, Asahel Kendrick, who was professor of Greek, took on the executive functions of the presidency from 1800 to 1853, and Kendrick's name is still embedded or enshrined in contemporary life here because we have Kendrick Road, and we have a residence hall that's called Kendrick Hall, named for Asahel Kendrick. But President Anderson, Martin Brewer Anderson, came in 1853, and he served for the unbelievable tenure of 35 years, from 1853 to 1888. He died in 1890, and his successor was this man, David Jane Hill, who came as a young 38-year-old, I think he was in his late 30s, came as our president. He's the shortest president in terms of tenure, the shortest term of our 10 presidents. We've had 10. He was our second. He served from 1880. He was appointed in 1888, took office in 1889, and resigned in 1896. Because what he really wanted to do was he was really looking to have a political career and a diplomatic career. And in fact, he became an ambassador to a couple of countries, Germany being one of them. But what is important about David Jane Hill for you to know is that he served as the fulcrum between Martin Brewer Anderson and the early days of our history, and Rush Reese, who also served an astonishing 35 years as president. He was the fulcrum, someone following on the heels of, quote, the great president in the case of Martin Brewer Anderson. It's not unusual that that person sort of sets the stage for the next great era of the university. And that's what David Jane Hill did. What did he do? Well, among other things, he expanded the curriculum. Martin Brewer Anderson was old school. And by old school, you didn't give students much choice. He didn't believe in residence halls because they were dens of iniquity. He didn't believe in athletics because of the violence associated with, quote, muscular Christianity. So he refused for there to be football. Remember, he retired in 1888. David Jane Hill came. Football was established in 1889. And there was an athletic association that included Syracuse, Utica, Cornell, and Union. And we were part of that. And what's great is in 1889, our first football match was against Union. No, I'm sorry, it was against Cornell. And the game was played in our stadium. We had a stadium, and the stadium was located at the corner of Culver and University, where the Gleason Works is. That was our first stadium. Does anybody know where our second stadium was? The site of the current East High School. So our second stadium was at the site of the current East High School. But our first football match was played at our stadium in the corner of Culver and University against Cornell. And the score, Cornell 106, Rochester 0. Hardly an auspicious start, I would say. But our second match was against Syracuse. Score, Rochester 36, Syracuse 0. So we and we ended with a 500 season. Not bad for our first outing, I would say. Let me just say a little thing. Where does our color, where does the notion of yellow jackets come from? Yellow, it's really kind of interesting that we have a weed for a flower, right? And we've got a bug for our mascot. Well, the weed, the dandelion, comes from that plot of land that I had just mentioned on Prince Street. Prince Street had been a grazing area for livestock because Azariah Booty, who lived in the house where you'll know this house, for those of you who've been around, he lived in the house where the Boy Scout headquarters were on East Avenue, right? On East Avenue near Prince Street. So he owned that house. But all those mansions on East Avenue, they went all the way back to University Avenue. Why? We didn't have Wegmans in those days, so you had to grow your own food and cultivate your own livestock. So that area that we know as the Prince Street campus was grazing land, and it was known as Pitkin's Woods. And the spring growth, of course, was the dandelion. Thus, that became our flower. The bug, the insect, came out of, we believe, out of football. But that happened much, much later, in which one of our great devoted supporters of the university, who always came to football games, would shout aloud at the stadium at where East High School is now, "Go you Yellow Jackets!" And their uniforms were yellow. And so that's where the yellow jacket idea comes from. So this is David Jane Hill. Another thing that's very important about Hill was we begin to see the establishment of the process by which women are going to be admitted to the University of Rochester. It was Hill who observed his wife had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl, and it was Hill who observed if the male and the female can coexist peacefully in the womb for 9 months, they ought to be able to go to classes together. But he left in 1896, and we then had two professors during an interregnum between 96 and 1900, an interregnum of 4 years. And Professor Samuel Lattimore, for whom Lattimore Hall is named, who was late in his career at that point, served as acting president from 1896 to 1898, and then for reasons of health, resigned. And Professor Henry Burton, for whom a residence hall is named, who was professor of Latin, was acting president from 1898 to 1900. So David Jane Hill, very important. Our first African-American, Charles Augustus Thompson, our first African-American graduate. And then Rush Reese came in 1900. Rush Reese, an astonishing, extraordinary president who served for 35 years as president, the first third of which were described by Arthur May, a professor of history who wrote probably the most important history of the university. It describes President Reese's tenure, 35-year tenure, as the first third was pretty terrible, the second third things were marginally better, and the third things happened in a major and significant way. And that's what I really want to get to this afternoon. But before I do, let's mention something about Susan B. Anthony. I can't remember if I talked about the admission of women. I did, so that is in the tape, so I'm not going to dwell on that except to just remind you that Susan B. Anthony lobbied long and hard for the admission of women and had already set the stage before President Reese took over. President Reese, who was not an advocate of coeducation, but rather if he were to support anything about the education of women, higher education of women, it was the coordinate college. But the die had been cast by the time he had arrived, largely by Susan B. Anthony, who, as it turned out, turned over because the trustees had set a goal of $100,000 that the women had to raise in order to support financially the admission of women. The women were able to raise only $40,000. They agreed to reduce that goal to $50,000. Which Miss Anthony says that raising the additional $10,000 was harder than raising the first $40,000 because they tapped everybody out, of course. But they were able to do that, except that when the board was going to consider the resolution, adopting the resolution to admit women, a $2,000 gift was disallowed as probably uncollectible. Miss Anthony, who was not well, got out of her sick bed over on Madison Street at her home and came down to the board meeting, which probably would have been held in Anderson Hall on the Prince Street campus. And to put her money where her mouth was, literally she surrendered the cash value of her whole life insurance policy to meet that goal of $50,000, and the board then adopted the resolution in 1900 admitting women. I will tell you that the campaign for women continued on beyond the 50K, and the trustees in their wisdom decided to return the life insurance policy to Miss Anthony. When Jim Thompson, Tom Farrell's predecessor, heard me say that in a talk someplace, he and some of our other colleagues in advancement came up to me and said, "Oh, please don't talk about giving it back. Please, that's just not something we do. Please don't talk about giving it back." But it is a fact of the matter. So that was given back to her. And women were admitted, and this was our first graduate, Ella Salome Wilcoxon. And this is a picture of her as a very young woman. The women had one room in Anderson Hall. It was not very comfortable. They were not well treated. And I'm not going to dwell on this because I think I'm looking up at our, who knows the tape. But here's a picture of the class of '04. So this is the basketball team from the first graduating class. And I love the next slide because here they come back for their 25th reunion. I have no idea what they have on their head, but it's cute. The first woman dean of the College for Women was Annette Gardner Monroe, a very distinguished academic who was appointed dean of women in 1910. So we were a coeducational college from 1900 when the women were admitted until 1912. In 1912, the trustees adopted a resolution that created a separate college for men and college for women. Annette Gardner Monroe had been hired in 1910 to serve as the first dean of the College for Women. And and this is our first female faculty member, Elizabeth Denio. Elizabeth Denio, who had been teaching at the university from 1902 to 1917. She taught art and art histories. And from 1902 to 1910, she had to rely on the generosity of Susan B. Anthony and her students who collected money to pay her. She did not have a faculty appointment, and she did not have a salary, so she relied on others to support her. In 1910, President Reese did indeed appoint her as a professor and provided her with a salary. And she served as a professor for another 7 years. She retired in 1917, and sadly, she was killed in that year. She was killed in an automobile accident at the corner of Meigs and East Avenue, where Third Pres is. She was struck by a car and died. Beatrice Amaza Howard I put here because she was our first African-American female graduate. This is a new slide that I decided to toss in. Even though residence halls were simply eschewed by the administration for much of the time, this is our first residence hall. And this is Kendrick Hall, men's dormitory, as you can see. It was built in the early part of the 20th century. It was never completed, although men did live there. And when the College for Men moved to the River campus, women lived there. Eventually it was razed, and there had been plans to expand it. But I thought you should see that in honor of Asahel Kendrick, our first residence hall was here on the Prince Street campus. This is our first gymnasium. This is the Alumni Gymnasium. And if you think of the Prince Street campus, this was built, it was completed in 1900. And in fact, President Rush Reese was inaugurated here. To give you some sense of where this was located, just picture Cutler Union. It was about on the site, right in roughly that area of the Prince Street campus that we had the Alumni Gymnasium. Of course, this building, as Kendrick Hall was raised, this also eventually was torn down too, particularly after the College for Women, actually before the College for Women, when Cutler Union was built in 1932. But we did have an Alumni Gymnasium. Now, in 1912, as I mentioned earlier, because the administration and higher education in general was not particularly sympathetic to the idea of co-education, even though our women and men had been going to the same classes for the first 12 years since the admission of women, the idea of the coordinate college existed with force. Hobart, William Smith. Harvard, Radcliffe. Columbia, Barnard. Duke, Trinity. And so the board adopted a resolution in 1912 creating this separate college for men and college for women. And they wanted to have their own building. Here you see the buildings that still exist. This is the corner of Prince and University. This building is called Catherine Strong Hall. It was the academic building and the office of the dean, Annette Gardner Monroe. This was built in 1914 and on land that had been owned by a university trustee. by the name of Munn, M-U-N-N. So in 1914, this was opened. Catherine Strong Hall, which is the academic building. And then in the back here, we have Anthony Memorial Gymnasium, which which handled the sort of co-curricular activities of the women and connected by a small cloister down here. Of course, those of you who are familiar with that site know that that building still exists, although the university no longer owns it. So the idea was that women and men could exist in certain classes together. Art and art history, no problem. Biology and anatomy, problem, right? So, but it was the times, okay? It was the times. And again, here's what these buildings look like. This one was sold recently, and I'm not sure who has bought it, but I'm looking forward to it because I've never been in that building. And it's directly across from the School of the Arts, which had been the building built in 1925 as the Eastman Residence Hall. Housing for men was this really serious problem, but the fraternities were the ones that attended to that problem. Here we have the Delta Upsilon House. This is at the corner of Strathallan and University Avenue. It's not there anymore. Instead, there are 4 townhouses. So if you picture right across from Cutler Union, where those townhouses are, this was the Delta Upsilon House originally. And the fraternity built it. They not only built it, they owned it. And most of our early fraternities had their own houses, and their houses were along Prince Street. So Psi Upsilon, Delta Kappa Epsilon, Theta Delta Chi, they all had their own houses, and most of those houses were located on Prince Street. And I don't think I got this far last time. Did I get this far? Oh, okay. So, but let me just briefly say, this is Emily Sibley Watson. Emily Sibley Watson was the daughter of Hiram Sibley. She is responsible for the funds that enabled the construction of the Memorial Art Gallery. Now, there's real confusion that I probably talked about in my first talk that I'm going to mention again because it's so confusing. Hiram Sibley was the 19th century what George Eastman was to the 20th century. A real industrialist and founder with his partner Don Alonzo Watson, Western Union. Hiram Sibley, the elder, had 2 children, Hiram Watson Sibley and Emily Sibley. Hiram Watson Sibley is the one responsible for the famous Sibley Music Library, and Emily of the Memorial Art Gallery. Now, Hiram Sibley and Don Alonzo Watson were partners, and they agreed in an effort to cement that relationship that the firstborn son of each would take the surname of the partner. So Hiram Sibley Jr. became Hiram Watson Sibley, and James Watson became James Sibley Watson. Emily had a first marriage that didn't survive, but she also knew James Sibley Watson. And they got together, right? And so Emily Sibley, Averill was her married name, but Emily Sibley then became Emily Sibley Watson. So it's been a source of confusion all over the place. Here's a 1905 sketch of a master plan that President Reese provided, and you can see he calls for an art museum here. Eventually, he was to get it in 1913 with the creation of the Memorial Art Gallery, which is dedicated to Emily's son, James Averill, the married name, the name of her first husband. And here's an image of it from its early days and how it looks today. James Gould Cutler. Now, James Gould Cutler was a trustee. He was really sort of a Renaissance man. Did I get to James Gould Cutler before? Okay, so very quickly. James Gould Cutler was, he'd been a politician, he'd been the mayor of the city, and an entrepreneur whose fortune was made with the invention of the Cutler mail chute. When you go into old high-rise buildings, skyscrapers, on the first floor, there's that big brass-colored brass-colored mail container. So businesses or residents on the 40th floor, if they wanted to mail a letter, they didn't want to take the elevator all the way down. So you'll recall, if you use your imagination, that between elevator doors, there's a chute, and you would just take and drop your letter in the chute, and it would sail all the way down into the big brass box. And next time you're in an old building which still has those boxes, go take a look, and you'll see that it says Cutler Mail Chute. And the manufacturing the manufactory was located behind Cutler Union, over in the area of Village Gate. So James Gould Cutler was a strong advocate. He and his wife were strong advocates for the education of women, and so he left in his will resources that resulted in the creation of the Cutler Union. So Cutler Union became, and that was in 1932. That was after the College for Men had moved to the River Campus. The College for Men moved to the River Campus in 1932, and the women needed a student union, and so thus did this happen. You'll notice it's a grand Gothic architecture, which President Reese was not crazy about, but you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And so we gave Mr. Cutler exactly what he wanted. Now this man, and I don't think I've spent much time with this man, right? So the rest of my time is going to be devoted to much to George Eastman and Rush Reese. Rush Reese started in 1900. George Eastman and the Eastman Kodak Company, we date back to about 1880. George Eastman was born in 1854, and he had only he left school at the age of 13. His father had died, and so while the family was originally from Waterville, New York, the father had a business in Rochester, and his business, interestingly enough, was a business school. So he wanted to train young men in the proper techniques and businesses of running a business. So he ran a business school here in Rochester that enjoyed some success. But then the father died. Mr. Eastman was actually in school at the time here in Rochester, because the family had moved out of Waterville to Rochester, and he was in school. And there's a certain irony. The school that he attended was located in the old United States Hotel, which was our first home. So it was an academy. It was called an academy named for the man who ran it. But when his father died, Mr. Eastman decided he needed to support his family, so he dropped out of school. It was about the age of 13. And he had a number of jobs, but he eventually became a bank clerk. But he was always interested in, he was really interested in this emerging phenomenon of photography, which was in its infancy certainly here, although its original, it has its origins in European technology and development. But he was interested in photography. And so he began puttering around in his mother's kitchen. And you can imagine back then, the technical process was astonishingly complicated. You needed all kinds of chemicals and all kinds of equipment. A friend of his had urged him he was going to take a trip someplace, and a friend had urged him to take the equipment and make pictures. He bought all of the equipment. He ended up not going on the trip. But he recognized that photography as a science and an art was restricted to very, very few. And he made, as an entrepreneur, that leap to, wouldn't it be something if we created the opportunity for everybody to be able to take pictures? You push the button, we do the rest. That was the motto at the time. And so the Brownie camera eventually was created in the 1890s. And Betsy Brayer, by the way, the late Betsy Brayer, who died only recently, produced the biography of George Eastman, and I commend it to you. It contains details to a fare thee well of the process that Mr. Eastman employed to get to where he got. The Brownie, by the way, is sometimes thought to, Brownie camera is sometimes thought to relate to Frank Brownell, who was who worked with Mr. Eastman and the company. It's not true. There was a cartoon series, cartoon characters called Brownies back in those days, and they appealed to children. And so Mr. Eastman thought that was attractive, and so his first camera, the Brownie, was named after those cartoon characters. The word Kodak, by the way, was an invention of Mr. Eastman's himself. He liked the letter K. It was his favorite letter. He wanted a word that was that had no national connection. And it was easy to say. And so he's the one who created the word Kodak. He had little appreciation for higher education. He was not an educated man particularly. He was fully engaged in his work as an industrialist. And so there was industry and commerce, and then there was this thing called higher education over here. And it took time for those two to harmonize, and it took Rush Reese to make that happen. His first gift to the university was a camera, which he gave to the geology department, to Herman Leroy Fairchild for research he was doing. That was in 1899. Now, as I talked in my last talk, I mentioned the buildings that were constructed on the Prince Street campus. The first being Anderson Hall, the second being Sibley Hall, which was our first library made possible by a gift from Hiram Sibley of Western Union. The third building was the Reynolds Laboratory in the 1880s, which was devoted to Samuel Lattimore and chemistry. But we didn't have a biology and physics building. And the natural sciences were beginning to evolve into distinct and separate disciplines, not simply the natural sciences, which is what they had been called in earlier generations. So we needed a physics and biology building. That building is this, and that building still stands. It is directly across from the School of the Arts. It is right next to that gate, the two gates that I showed you. And this is our first biology and physics building. Well, the cost of this building was pegged at $150,000. President Reese, who had begun to make overtures to Mr. Eastman, and their relationship began to grow, decided he would ask Mr. Eastman for a gift to fund this. So it was $150,000, and but to build and maintain it was about $75,000, something like that. So he visited with Mr. Eastman and put the request to him. Mr. Eastman gave him $10,000. President Reese was disappointed, and he showed it. And it's interesting because President Reese called him, Mr. Eastman called him on it. Said, "I see that you are disappointed." To which, good advancement officer that he was, President Reese said, "Not at all. We are immensely grateful for your gift, and I assure you, Mr. Eastman, that we shall use this as leverage to raise the money that we need in order to fully fund our building." And he took his leave. The next day, President Reese received on his desk a check for $65,000. And Mr. Eastman said of that, reportedly said, "I gave him the money because he didn't nag me for it." Number one. And number two, I want to tell you, this is my first and last gift to the University of Rochester. When Jim Thompson and others heard me say that, they said, "Please don't tell people that. Please don't say that." Because we don't want the first gift to be the last gift. We really don't. And indeed, in this case, the first gift was not the last gift. Mr. Eastman agreed to have his name applied to this building. And when you go through the gates that I first showed you, over the gateway right here, it says Eastman. So it was the Eastman building. We no longer own it, although our Center for Community Health and the Medical Center has its offices there. So now, the first 2/3 of President Reese's presidency, terrible, modestly better. In 1918, Mr. Eastman, who was a great lover of music, but who referred to himself as a musical moron, by then he had built his mansion. The mansion at 900 East Avenue, he had built that in 1905. and he had music in there all the time. It had an organ, and Harold Gleason of the Eastman organ faculty was his regular organist, and so there was organ music for him for breakfast. By the way, he was not a fan of Johann Sebastian Bach. I cannot imagine what Professor Gleason, there was not much left for him to play, but in any event, every morning, 4 or 5 days a week, he would be there, and when Mr. Eastman descended the grand staircase, Mr. Gleason would be playing for him while he had his breakfast. And Mr. Eastman had his breakfast in that big open atrium there. That's where he had off the dining room. So he was a great lover of music. And so he approached President Reese in 1918 to say, what would you think of having a music school? Now, President Reese found that idea interesting, but only if the resources were available to ensure quality of this music school in perpetuity. That was absolutely essential. So he acceded to Mr. Eastman's invitation to have a music school, and Mr. Eastman bought this. This is 47 Prince Street at the site of the current School of the Arts, formerly the residence halls for the Eastman School. 47 Prince Street was the home of the DKG Institute of Musical Art, a very fine conservatory in the European style. D for Hermann Dossenbach, K for Alf Klingenberg, and G for Oskar Gereisen, musicians of renown at the time. So for $28,000, he bought the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel, turned it over to the university for $1. This is the first home of the Eastman School of Music. It has been raised since then, and Mr. Eastman then went about acquiring the land at Gibbs and East and Swan Streets to build his theater and his school. Here we have a picture from 1921. The school itself is here, is to the right, here, and the theater is under construction. I draw your attention to this building here. This building was a mixed-use building that had apartments on the upper floors and commercial properties on the lower floors. Mr. Eastman wanted to acquire it, but the guy who owned the property wanted money that Mr. Eastman thought was outrageous, and so he said, to hell with you, I'll build my theater and my school around you, which is precisely what he did. And so the construction was underway, and here we see it in 1922. It actually opened September 4th, 1922. You can see this monster here, which continued to be there for quite some time. It continued to be there until the 1950s, actually. And some of you who've been around a long time will remember the Eastman sign that was on the building here. And then across the top, Mr. Eastman's sentiment about building this for the greater good of I can't remember the perfect language here. Who knows? For the enrichment of community life. That's what it says up top here. And so here we see an early image of the Eastman School. Now, the first director, people think that Howard Hansen was the first director of the Eastman School. Not so. Alf Klingenberg was, the K of DKG. Mr. Klingenberg was a pianist and composer and Norwegian. But he didn't satisfy the ambition of Rush Reese and George Eastman about the creation of a school. Mr. Klingenberg kept the school sort of stuck in a 19th century European conservatory model. And so he had a contract from 18 to 23, 5-year contract, as we still do. And in 1923, Mr. Eastman fired him. So you might say, how is it that Mr. Eastman could fire him? Well, when he made the gift to create the school, he created a board of managers. Part of the terms of the gift was the creation of a board of managers to whom the University Board of Trustees would delegate responsibility for management issues, and guess who was the first chair of the Board of Managers? Mr. Eastman. So Mr. Eastman actually fired Mr. Klingenberg. I've seen the letters, actually. The first letter is the one you write and don't send, and the second one is much more diplomatic. So Mr. Klingenberg was given a year's sabbatical, and he eventually made his way back to Norway. But then we had to find leadership. And so this is arguably thought of as the brains, the brawn, the intelligence, and the inspiration for the Eastman School of Music becoming one of the world's greatest institutions, Howard Hanson. At the time, Hanson was only 28 years old in 1923. He's only 28 years old. He was already the dean of the School of Music at the University of the Pacific in California. He had just won the Prix de Rome in composition, which is, even today, winning the Prix de Rome is a big deal. And so President Reese, with Mr. Eastman's full concurrence, went after Howard Hanson to encourage him to become the president, or the director of, as we called it back then, the director of the Eastman School. Dr. Hanson agreed to do that, and he came and took the reins in 1924. And he held that office from 1924 to the year I arrived in 1964. I can still remember seeing the aging Howard Hanson back in those days. And he really converted the institution into an American school, professional school of music associated with the university. Fundamental principle. Absolutely fundamental, that it be an American professional school of music with an association with a university, which that was not part of Mr. Klingenberg's vision for this, and that's why his administration did not survive. It's so interesting to me to read the correspondence between Klingenberg and President Reese. It was like pulling teeth. President Reese exhorting, encouraging, pleading with Mr. Klingenberg to do this, that, or the other thing. And Klingenberg clearly having difficulty making that transition. With Hanson, he took charge with such force that President Reese and Mr. Eastman were absolutely thrilled. And in fact, in later correspondence, after he'd really gotten his sea legs, Dr. Hanson that is, President Reese would end his letters to, because they did a lot of correspondence, written correspondence, mail correspondence, would end his correspondence with the complimentary close, "Love, Rush." So he really was very, very fond of Howard Hanson. So to Hanson must go the credit for positioning the institution, for hiring a great faculty, for seeing to it that the student body reflected not just a local, much of the student body was local in the earliest days, but regional, national, and eventually even international. So a tremendous debt of gratitude has to be owed to Howard Hanson. And again, many of you have been in the theater, no doubt. This is the 2010 renovation of the theater. I put this slide in because of this. You'll recall that horrible building that Mr. Eastman refused to buy. Well, eventually we bought it in the early 50s, raised that building, and it served as a parking lot at grade. It was a horrible looking site because when you came up Main Street, what you saw was the back of the theater, and it just looked terrible. Some of you will remember it. It was my first sight when I came as a freshman. I thought, yuck, that looks awful. Well, no more, because in 2010, this addition that we call the East Wing with the Hatch Recital Hall inside, if you've not been in, I strongly urge you to, because it's a magnificent addition to the rest of the complex. And I like to think that Mr. Eastman and President Reese are in the hereafter somewhere smoking cigars and having cognac, and Mr. Eastman is looking at Reese and saying to him, well, they finally got it right, even though it took them long enough. All right. The next piece that I want to focus on a bit in the time remaining to me is the medical center. The Carnegie Foundation in the early part of the 20th century commissioned a study that was led by a man named Abraham Flexner. And Flexner's responsibility with this commission was to do a study of the quality of medical education in the United States. That yielded a report in 1910 that is familiarly referred to as the Flexner Report. It's also Carnegie Report number 4. But the Flexner Report is famous because it changed medical education forever in the United States. It excoriated almost all of the medical schools that existed at the time. Martha and I could, back in the old days, in the 19th century, when the notion of professional education as an apprentice function existed with real force. Law, business, and medicine. Martha and I could set up our own medical school. All we need is a shingle, right? And I would tell her, you take care of one half and I'll take care of the other half. We wouldn't have no idea what we're doing, but if the patient doesn't die, we must have done something right. So Flexner challenged all of that, and he came up with some very important recommendations. One, that the medical schools should be connected to a university and be under the aegis of the administration and trustees of a university. Had not been the case before. Two, that students admitted to medical school should have, at a minimum, the bachelor's degree or its equivalent. Three, that the medical education should be a 4-year course of study, the first 2 years of which would be science-based. And that was his biggest objection, was that it was not science-based. So the first 2 years should be science-based, and the third and fourth years should be clinically based. And that is the model which largely continues to exist today. And the fourth recommendation was, and this was the real tough one, that medical school faculty members should relinquish their fee-for-service practices and be salaried by the university. Well, that went over like a lead balloon, I assure you. Faculty simply could not wrap their minds around that. Why? Because the fee-for-service was their cash cow. That was very important to their as a revenue source for them. So at any rate, Flexner had moved from Carnegie to the Rockefeller Foundation, where he was responsible for what was called the General Education Board. The General Education Board of the Rockefeller Foundation, funded by Rockefeller money, which was probably the largest foundation in terms of revenue that it had to dispense of any in the country. I've heard numbers as much as, back in those days, $200 million to dispense. So the Rockefeller Foundation recruited Abraham Flexner to run the General Education Board and see to and oversee the disbursement of these resources, a man of tremendous power. So he looked at New York State, among other states, at where the Flexner Report recommendations could be implemented. Cornell told him no. Columbia told him no. So he looked at Rochester, and his comment was, Rochester is a fine college with terrific and effective leadership, and two other things. They don't currently have a medical school, and they do have George Eastman. So he prevailed on President Reese to see to it that arrangements were made for him, Flexner, to meet with Mr. Eastman. And that was done at the mansion 900 East Avenue. Flexner came, it was a breakfast meeting. The breakfast meeting was so interesting to Mr. Eastman that turned into a lunch meeting, and the lunch meeting turned into dinner. And upshot end of it all is that Mr. Eastman agreed to provide $4 million. They figured that the bogey was about 10. He agreed to $4 million in support of the effort if the General Education Board would come up with 5. And the additional $1 million Mr. Eastman was hoping to get from the daughters of Henry Alva Strong, for whom Strong Auditorium is named, for whom Strong Memorial Hospital is named. And his 2 daughters, Helen and Gertrude, Mr. Eastman prevailed upon them to come up with that $1 million, which they did. So $10 million was raised to begin the process of the creation of the School of Medicine and Dentistry. Now, this was about 1920, 21. So imagine, the Eastman School of Music is underway. Plans are being made for there to be a School of Medicine and Dentistry and a hospital. And one other thing is, at the same time, we're looking to move the university to acquire land in order to enable all of this expansion. And so discussions were underway about Oak Hill Country Club, which is what some of you may know. The River campus was the original site of Oak Hill Country Club. to my mind, to my way of thinking, it's just astonishing what happened in the 1920s. I mean, the invention, the creativity, and the just dogged hard work that it took to coordinate all of these activities. And Mr. Eastman was really sort of at the center of it. Leadership. Just as Howard Hanson was so important to the Eastman School, we needed someone to sort of oversee the creation of this new medical school and the hospital. And so at the University of San Francisco was this man, a young fellow by the name of George Whipple. And George Whipple was he was pretty well established at the University of San Francisco, although they were experiencing some financial issues which Whipple was worried about. Nonetheless, he did not really jump at the chance at our initial overture. Finally, Mr. Eastman said to President Reese, look, he actually bought the train ticket for President Reese and said, here, you go out there and meet with him and talk him into coming. President Reese was successful, and in 1921, Dr. Whipple came to Rochester with his research enterprise and his people, actually, and they set up offices in that physics and biology building that I originally showed you, while they then went about the task of the design and construction of the School of Medicine and Dentistry and Strong Memorial Hospital. The laying of the cornerstone was 1923. The medical school opened in 1925, and Strong Memorial Hospital admitted its first patient in 1926. And here are what I call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Left to right, Rush Reese, Abraham Flexner, George Eastman, and George Whipple. An astonishing, absolutely astonishing accomplishment. Well, the move to the River Campus was not an easy matter. We had a golf course here and a country club. And there were lots of ideas about where it should be, because the Prince Street campus, which had been home from 1861 up to this point, up into the 20s, there was little room for expansion, little room for us to grow to the extent that these new opportunities were going to present. And so the one place that they were looking at Genesee Valley Park and a bunch of other places. But the idea of Oak Hill existed with real force. And it is this man, George Todd, for whom Todd Union is named, who was the prime mover behind the acquisition of the land and the process by which it then became the River Campus. George Todd and his brother were the inventors of a process. They made their fortune by creating a check writing process. You'll know, you've all probably had the experience of going to get a cashier's check, and the amount of the cashier's check is sort of raised, embossed on the paper. George Todd and his brother invented that. And at the time, I mean, who uses it much anymore? But at the time, it was very popular because it provided a kind of security. So that's how he made his fortune. He was never a trustee. He was elected twice, but declined both times on the theory that he could be more effective by not being a trustee. But it is to George Todd that much of the credit must go for the creation of the River Campus. And so the College for Men, imagine this, between 1927 and 1930, that land was converted from a golf course to the land that we now know. And when I think about the technology that was available in 1927, it's just amazing how they were able to do that. But indeed, they did it in 1930. The College for Men picked itself up from the Prince Street campus and moved to the River Campus. And this is what the Prince Street campus looked like from a painting. I haven't been able to find other images of the land, but this gives you some sense. It had been Native American land for a long time, all the way back to the 12th century when the Algonquin Indians were located there. Other prominent leaders that I want to mention, Joseph Wilson. Joseph Wilson, after Mr. Eastman, probably our largest individual donor. He was the CEO and one of the founders of Xerox Corporation, and of course his name is embedded in buildings and in programs here at the university, and very well deserved. He's an alum, 1931, and just a very distinguished person. So when I think about the titans of the University of Rochester, the Wilson family, and in particular Joe Wilson's name, has to sit at the top. Allen Valentine came after President Reese retired. President Reese retired in 1935. Allen Valentine came as our president from 1935 until 1950, a period of 15 years. And he came at a very difficult time because what did we have? We had the Depression, the economic depression, and we had World War II. So President Valentine's real challenge was just making everything hang together. He was very handsome, he was attractive, he was exciting, and he brought a lot of esprit de corps and to the campus at a time when the university was really, the nation, I should say, the nation was struggling. Willem de Kiewit, W-I-L-L-E-M. He was a Netherlander, he was a Dutchman, but he was raised and educated in South Africa. And two things I want to mention about de Kiewit that are important. He came in 1950-51, and he served for 10 years. And what's important about him was overseeing the move of the College for Women to the River campus. Not an easy task. When the idea was presented, when the idea was first brought forward, there were trustees who absolutely were opposed, including the chairman of the board, who was, help me Ruth, Bausch and Lomb CEO, Eisenhart. Herbert W. Eisenhart, who was chairman of the board and lived in the house at the corner of East Avenue and East Boulevard, the one with the circular driveway. And he was absolutely opposed. And there's this famous story that de Kiewit had dinner or lunch with Mr. Eisenhart at the Eisenhart house on East Avenue, at the end of which, as he was taking his leave, Eisenhart put his arm around de Kiewit, and as de Kiewit was stepping out of the house, Eisenhart said, "Now Dick," he was referred to not as Willem, but as Dick. He said, "Now Dick, this business about the women coming to the River campus, let's have no more of it." So President de Kiewit put his presidency on the line to make it happen. It had to happen. It was right for educational purposes, but it was also right for financial purposes. Maintaining those two campuses was simply not financially viable in the long term, and other institutions found that to be true as well. So de Kiewit was important for that, but also it was important in 1958. 3 more of our professional schools emerged. Remember, we had the Eastman School in 1921, we had the medical school in 1924. In 1958, the School of Business, the School of Education, and the School of Engineering emerged. They had been departments in the College of Arts and Sciences. So they emerged in 58 as their own separate professional schools. The School of Nursing, which had existed as part of the Medical Center, emerged as the school we know today in 1971. Alan Wallace succeeded de Kiewit in 61, and his presidency saw to the arrival as his provost of Bob Sproul in 1968. Alan Wallace, who was a very prominent dean of the School of Business at the University of Illinois, really saw to the expansion of our graduate program. And so we really credit him with not just preserving the excellence, but by accelerating our graduate program, the quality of the academic enterprise put us in a league with our friendly competitors among the new Ivies that include Washington University, University of Chicago, Case Western Reserve, Carnegie Mellon, Hopkins, and a few others. And I think to Alan Wallace goes a lot of the credit for ensuring that faculty and programs were developed that enabled that to happen. Bob Sproul arrived in 1968 as provost, and in 1970, Bob Sproul was appointed president and COO, and Alan Wallace acceded to a newly created position of chancellor. We'd only had one chancellor before that, and that was at the very beginning of founding of the university in 1850, and it was largely a ceremonial position. So President Wallace, now Chancellor Wallace, served in that capacity until about 1975, and then President and COO Bob Sproul in 75 became President and CEO. And Bob Sproul served as president and CEO from 1975 until 1985. And he's one of the things that he's responsible for, a number of things, but not the least of which is the creation of the Laboratory for Laser Energetics. Dennis O'Brien came in 1985, hired me from the Eastman School where I'd been Dean of Students, and importantly, his interest was a quality of student life. So my responsibilities as Vice President and University Dean of Students was working hard with my colleagues, not only in the College of Arts and Science, but in other units to enhance and strengthen student life. Tom Jackson is very important for the creation of something called the Renaissance Plan in his presidency from 1995 to 2005. And the Renaissance Plan he focused his attention on two areas: the College of Arts and Sciences and Engineering, which he combined. They'd been separate schools, and he combined them as the college, as the School of Arts and Education, or the School of Arts and Sciences and the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, all under the rubric of the college, and improving the preparation of students who were entering as freshmen. And so the Renaissance Plan saw to move the quality of those students entering from a certain level to a higher level, while at the same time preserving what was important to me, important to the university with respect to diversity, with respect to gender, et cetera. It was a long, hard slog. We were successful at some times, not so successful at other times, but at the end of the day, I think we got where we needed to be. The other area that Tom Jackson was a focus of his attention was the medical center. And some of you will remember the arrival of Jay Stein and the sort of tumultuous tsunami waves that administration created to try to focus us. And just to give you one data point of reference, prior to Jay's arrival, the university in a very short period of time had seen its ranking in terms of its receipt of external sources of funding for medical research from 14th, which is distinguished, to 28th. And so Jay Stein's job was to reverse that. Very difficult to do, particularly because the other medical centers were not standing still. Joel Seligman. I have a special place in my heart for Joel Seligman. I was his senior advisor for 12 and a half years. And I try to describe, and I've told him this and I've told the trustees this, I try to describe Joel Seligman's tenure as president, 12 and a half year tenure as presidency in the following ways. Just as there are two presidents that stand out for special notice. Rush Reese is one, Joel Seligman is the other. Rush Reese, I've given you a lot of detail about. Over 35 years, what he did was usher the University of Rochester into the 20th century. Joel Seligman, and with Rush Reese, most of it happened in the last 12 and a half years of his presidency. The first 2/3 were devoted to getting ready. Joel Seligman ushered the university into the 21st century. The growth, I've been around for 54 years, and I will tell you that the growth and development that I have observed and my lived experience over the last 12 and a half years has been astonishing and on a par with the accomplishments of Rush Reese. Are we perfect in every respect? No, all of us have clay feet. But is the university a stronger and better place as a result of the efforts and the hard work of our leadership? Absolutely, no less so with Joel Seligman. And now, my old friend, whom I have known I've known Rich since 1987 when I came over as the vice president. And he has the job, as did Samuel Lattimore and Henry Burton in the last 4 years of the 19th century, of guiding our ship safely and securely while we go through the process of identifying our 11th permanent president. And I have every confidence in the world because I've known Rich and I've worked with him at great detail on a variety of things. Most recently, he and I co-chaired the Commission on Race and Diversity in 2016. I have every reason to think that this man, who's been here for 40 years, not as long as I have, but for 40 years is every bit up to the task. And we have reason to be thankful, appreciative, and confident that the university is and will be in good hands. And with that, I'm 10 minutes over. But that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.